Welcome to Beat Everyone. I'm Ben Flanagan with AL.com, and Alabama is back in the national news, and it's not even football somehow. It's basketball. The Alabama Crimson Tide men's basketball team hosted Tennessee inside Coleman Coliseum on Saturday, and a familiar face rejoined the Crimson Tide, Charles Bediako, and he has been making nothing but headlines over the past couple of weeks now, and we're going to get to that in just a second. And another person who was there was Kalen DeBoer. He was sitting near courtside. He was sitting with athletics director Greg Byrne and his family, and he was there. And this is obviously, I believe, the first basketball game he's attended since the football season ended. And now the recruiting season's underway. The portal has closed, but they're still adding people to the roster. We're joined by AL.com Alabama sports beat writer Nick Kelly. Nick, you along with your colleagues, Matt Stahl and Michael Casagrande, you've been reporting on this Charles Bediako story with all of its twists and turns, but we'll get to him in just a second. But I want to ask you about the DeBoer end of this. We'll get to basketball in just a minute, but just because I happened to spot him and everybody else did at the game, what can you tell us about Alabama football's offseason at the moment? Is there any update in terms of any players they're adding? We know that they just recently parted with the offensive line coach, so there are changes happening within the football program.
Yeah, not everything's set in stone, but it definitely is slowing down in a big way. And yeah, they can still maybe add a player or two, but I think for the most part, you've seen a lot of their big pieces added so far, and maybe they supplement a little bit in the portal, but I would be surprised if it's anything of great note. So yeah, I think they lost a lot of guys. They brought in a lot of guys. So it's been a bit of a Grand Central Station kind of thing of, hey, these guys depart, these guys come in. And this was always going to be inevitable with the defense, especially because you had a lot of older guys in that defense, and they brought a lot of them back for the 2025 season. And 2026 meant a lot of those guys were going to be out of eligibility. And so Alabama's having to essentially replace a lot of different players there. And then you have a few more portal departures. Man, maybe we can say deportal. Is that a new verb we can create? But anyway, you have a few guys in the defense leave as well in the portal. And yeah, a lot of new faces now that we're going to see on the defensive line, the linebacker core. The DBs will be pretty similar, but yeah, there's going to be a lot of change. For better or for worse, there's going to be a big reset, I think, from that team a season ago.
Yeah, for sure. So, well, it's good to know that things are happening, and there are things that fans wanted to happen after what they saw against Indiana. People thought that there needed to be a change with the offensive line, whether it was with personnel or with coaching, and all of that is happening. So I think fans are going to be pleased to know that something is happening regardless. So back to basketball here, Nick. I mentioned that you and your colleagues have been reporting on this Charles Bediako story with all of its twists and turns, as I said. But first thing I want to ask you here, Nick, who is Charles Bediako?
Charles Bediako is the former pro who's now back in college. It's kind of that in a much lesser way, the back to school Ronnie Dangerfield film type of deal where, yeah, he was a guy who left Alabama in 2023. He was with the team for 2 seasons at center. And then he entered the NBA draft, didn't get drafted, but he signed an NBA contract with San Antonio's program. And now he never played an NBA game, but for 3 years, he spent time in the G League, which is their developmental league for the NBA. And he ended up deciding to try and pursue college again because the door had been cracked wider and wider by the NCAA to let former pros come into college athletics. But what made him different is he was a guy who had been in college already. And then he signed an NBA contract, and now he's back, and he got a judge to grant a temporary restraining order that allowed him to come and play for Alabama again. So he was in the Tennessee game this past weekend playing in Coleman Coliseum for the first time since 2023. So it really was just surreal and strange to see him back there. But at the same time, once the game got going, you kind of got used to it again, just seeing Charles Bediako kind of defending that low post.
Nick, we can always count on you for the current movie references like Back to School and Rodney Dangerfield. So we appreciate that.
Hey,
so,
if you want references, Ben, to 2020s movies, you're going to have to get me on the podcast in about 20, 30 years from now.
All right, we'll do that. We'll schedule it. I know you're a busy guy. So I have to know here, and I think a question that a lot of people, even outside of Alabama, probably have with this is, with such an uncertain future at the professional level, when Charles Bediako made that decision, why did he leave Alabama at the time?
Yeah, I think he frankly got bad advice because I don't think a lot of folks really thought he would be an NBA draft pick or that he would go in the first round, certainly. And he decided to go out anyway. I remember at that time, he kind of surprised the staff and he surprised a lot of people, I think, involved with the process that he decided to go out for the draft. Didn't get selected. So that kind of indicated what a lot of people thought was true. So it was bad advice. It was a decision that hurt not only him but also Alabama. Think if Alabama has him on that Final Four team. They needed a big man like that, and they didn't have him. They somehow made the Final Four without that kind of presence on their team. But if they had him, maybe they don't beat UConn, but they at least have a better shot. So there's a lot of what ifs, and it always kind of has been this conversation around Charles Bediako of, man, if this team had him, or they could really use a guy like Charles Bediako. Well, now they have Charles Bediako again. So that's what's kind of strange about all this is this decision that he made that I think a lot of people knew was the wrong decision. He kind of gets to undo that in a way. And I never thought we'd be here in this moment, but here we are.
So what's interesting is that Bediako played during the NIL era in college sports, right? And it's obviously evolved in pretty extraordinary ways since he left. But as you said, he probably got bad advice, or certainly what he can look back on as bad advice. And you have to wonder, did he think his financial future had more upside in the pros than it would had he stayed at Alabama or even transferred to another school?
Yeah. I mean, you kind of have to wonder because I think at that point, people can say it was the NIL era, but there was different money than there is in college basketball now. To where Alabama's roster in that Final Four roster, I'm not sure, Ben, that it was $1 million roster total. I'm not sure that in total they were paying much over 1 million, if not even at $1 million. Whereas now you're seeing players get in the high six figures, low seven figure kind of numbers that aren't that absurd. I mean, the highest players are probably making somewhere in the 4 to 5 range in college basketball, but at that point, no, the money was not near as big as it is now because it really kind of just keeps increasing every single season and every year at this point. So, yeah, it was it was the same era of that you could make money off your name, image, and likeness. But in terms of just straight cash, it wasn't quite the same that it is now. But yeah, I think that that'd be something I'd love to ask Charles about and really sit down with him and discuss is what went into that decision and kind of what advice was he given that he thought that'd be a good decision, because clearly it was not. And again, I don't think a lot of people at the time thought it was a good decision, but someone got in his ear and told him it was, and here we are.
$1 million roster, not even for Alabama, $1 million at not even Alabama in football. That's how you get a guy to even come on campus, is to pay him $1 million in some cases. So that's pretty crazy how things have changed, Nick. So how did Bediako's return to Alabama begin to take shape? Like, when did Bediako establish that he wanted back in college, and when did Nate Oates in Alabama get involved in his return?
Yeah, I really think that started to bubble up about a month ago at the end of December when James Najee was able to come back to Baylor, or come to Baylor, I should say, not come back to. So James Najee was a player selected in the same draft that Charles Bediako declared for. Now, he didn't play in the NBA, he didn't sign an NBA contract. He went pro for 3 years in Europe. And then recently, the NCAA, I say recently, this is toward the end of December, the NCAA granted James Najee eligibility. So he didn't have to go to the court system to be able to come play college basketball. Well, I think people in Tuscaloosa and people in Charles Bediako's camp saw that door opening even more than it had been before, because here you have an NBA draft pick getting to come back to college. Come to college again. I shouldn't say back to, because that's what makes Charles different, is he was the first one to really come back to college. But yeah, I think that once that happened, it starts getting people, okay, hey, what would it look like if Charles were to come back? Because Alabama, more than anything else, what this boils down to, Ben, is Alabama had a need of what Charles can do. They needed help, and they need more big men. They need more guys in their front court who can do what Charles Bediako can do, and they've had a lack of that for various circumstances. So I think Alabama started to explore it, see if it's legally possible, what their options were, and then they, at one point, asked the NCAA to grant him eligibility like James Najee was, but the NCAA denied that. So Alabama decided to go through the court system to get that temporary restraining order for Charles Bediako. And so this all, again, just over the last month has played out. And I had heard rumblings about it, but I just never thought that it would actually happen. I just doubted that this would actually come to fruition. But then lo and behold, last week, all of a sudden, the official essentially order, or the complaint was filed in the court system. And a couple days later, Charles Bediako is playing basketball for Alabama again.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reason we're sitting here right now is because he filed a lawsuit against the NCAA in Tuscaloosa Circuit Court. He requested temporary and permanent injunctions to allow him to play out the 2026 season despite his pro status. So, Nick, I'm just curious, what legal reason did this judge in Tuscaloosa give that granted him this restraining order and his eligibility to even play again?
So again, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm a sports writer, so this is me learning secondhand to a large extent. But essentially, a temporary restraining order is a move that is kind of an emergency move, if you will. Like it is something that is done under, hey, you don't need a hearing, you don't need all the wheels of justice that turn slowly to turn for you. So it's something where essentially his Charles Bediako's camp argued that irreparable harm would be caused if he was not granted immediate eligibility to play. And they talked about financial damages. They talked about, uh, again, the season's going on. So this is not something that they argued could wait for days or weeks or months, because a lot of times things just take that time in the court system. So this is something where a judge can just sign it and put it into motion, and it either lasts 10 days or until a hearing takes place. And that's the situation with Charles's, where a hearing was set within the 10-day window. So again, it's a very temporary thing that a judge does not need to hear all the facts of the case. He or she doesn't need to hear from both sides. It's just, hey, this is something that, based on the filing, this needs to be done immediately, and then it'll be revisited once the sides can come together and actually discuss it in a hearing.
Well, Nick, certainly the NCAA is not just going to sit there and take it. What has their response to the ruling been?
Yeah, their stance has been that players who sign NBA contracts should not have eligibility in the college ranks again. And that's been put out via statement, and they're going to fight that in court in different ways. I'm sure we haven't heard what their arguments are going to be just yet. But again, this is something they've been against. That is where they have drawn the line in the sand. The problem is the line has moved in different ways. And so how that impacts what a court will rule in the future, we'll see, because the NCAA has had a lot of tough times in court trying to argue for different rules. Now, one thing, it would be different if Charles was outside of his 5-year window to play for. He is still within that window. He's 23 years old. So there are players that, okay, say there's a 30-year-old who was like, hey, I'd like to come back to college. That's a little different, because he or she would not necessarily be in their 5-year window like they were, like Charles is at this moment. So, yeah, I think essentially we'll see how the NCAA fights it, but they just haven't had much luck. And they did say in one of their statements that this is why Congress needs to get involved and needs to act. And whether that's possible or how soon that would be in the picture, I'm not sure. But the NCAA continues to say congressional intervention is needed to essentially set some parameters, because these goalposts keep moving.
Nick, you followed and covered Alabama basketball for a long time during the Nate Oates era in Tuscaloosa. Nate Oates is someone who, for better or worse, often shares his opinions publicly and is convicted in them. And I wonder, you mentioned that Alabama had a need at the position that Charles Bediako plays, but just through this whole process, the national attention that it's gotten, how would you describe how Nate Oates has been portrayed or portrayed himself during all this?
Yeah, I think he doesn't care. I think he doesn't care how he's portrayed. I think he is focused on two things. One, this can help his basketball team. And I think that he sees an opportunity for them to improve in their front court. And so that is its base level is what this is. Second off, he talked a lot about his belief that essentially American players shouldn't be punished in ways that European players aren't. And Charles Bediako, he's from Canada, but he has played at the different levels in the United States. And he's also a registered voter, Ben, in the United States. So he may also actually be an American citizen. I haven't confirmed that, but he is a registered voter. I can confirm that in the United States. So Nate has made a point to say that why should guys who go play professionally in Europe get to do things where guys who play professionally in America or in the United States do not get to do that. And so a lot of it is I think Alabama is willing to not only, hey, play Charles, take the heat, but also try to point out that this system's broken. I mean, that's the first thing that Nate Oates said when he had his press conference after Charles was ruled immediately eligible, was the system is broken. And I think that Alabama is looking to prove a point that Greg Byrne, the athletics director, put out a statement indicating as much that, hey, maybe this can be part of them working toward a solution. So I think it's Alabama in some ways pointing out the absurdity and the inconsistency of the rules, and the NCAA trying to define what a professional is or is not. So there's a lot at stake, more than, hey, is this going to improve Alabama's ability to get rebounds or block shots? That's at play in this, but there's a lot that's going to be said and determined from this case based on Charles Bediako and his playing future.
What about everybody else, Nick? How has the college basketball world outside of the Alabama program reacted to this?
I think there's been a lot of negative tension, no doubt. I think there's been some folks that disagree with it vehemently and are very much so against it. You have national pundits who've indicated as much. You've had some coaches indicate as much, but then you also have coaches who've been like, hey, I don't like it, but I understand why Nate Oates is doing it. I mean, Stephen Pearl at Auburn said something along those lines. Todd Golden at Florida said something along those lines. And so, and I'm completely paraphrasing, but that was kind of the general vibe of what they said was, hey, these coaches are under immense pressure to try and win. And essentially, if this is going to be allowed, then they can understand why Nate Oates would want to try and do something like this. But at the same time, I think two things can be true at once. You don't have to like that this is where college athletics, college basketball are at, but this is where they're at. So in some ways, they can understand why Nate Oates would do something like this. But there has been certainly a lot of discussion that this is not the right move and that this is not good for college basketball.
So, Nick, Charles Bediako did play in the game against Tennessee in Coleman Coliseum on Saturday, January 24th. How would you describe the scene as he made his return in that building?
It was kind of like a conquering hero coming back home. I mean, it felt a little prodigal son-like, right? Where this guy, he leaves when he shouldn't have and kind of surprises the program, but he comes back to this, I mean, applause, standing ovation. I mean, people were excited when he checked in and out of games. I mean, he didn't have to really do anything, and he was getting applause and cheers and, chuck, chuck, chuck chants. But then when he did dunk or when he did make a play to stop Tennessee, he got a lot of applause. So it was kind of a wild scene, frankly, Ben, that essentially his past transgressions, the fact that he's a highly controversial figure right now in college basketball, you would not have known it in Coleman Coliseum on Saturday.
There was a big moment where he scored his first 2 points. It was on an inbounds play. He caught a pass with a free lane, had a free lane to the rim, and just slammed it, and the place went crazy. So
yeah,
Alabama brought back an athlete who has been playing professional basketball for the last 2 years. He played in the game, and they lost the game. But, Nick, what was the aftermath outside of Alabama that they went to all this trouble to bring back Bediako, and that was the result?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of making fun of Alabama. Hey, just because you do things a certain way doesn't mean you win, or, karma is being thrown around. Of course, Tennessee, their basketball account trolled Alabama by making a G League reference. And so, yeah, it was predictable. I wasn't surprised by it just because it is low-hanging fruit to make fun of that Alabama brought this guy back and still couldn't win. I mean, it's predictable. I think that not having Amari Allen and not having Aiden Holloway certainly hurt them a lot. Those are their number 2 and 3 scorers on this team. So that did not help. But yeah, I think a lot of folks in college basketball felt some vindication that just because you tried and found this loophole in the rules that they still weren't able to win a game. So we'll see moving forward what it means and how it plays out. But that first result, it was, I think, for the folks who are against the move, it was some vindication there.
Well, and I think a question that a lot of fans have now that Bediako has played, what if he is ruled ineligible later by the NCAA? Is he one and done this season? If Alabama had beaten Tennessee, would they have to vacate that result? What are the potential competitive ramifications this season now that Bediako has suited up for a game?
Yeah. So first off, Nate Oates was asked that question, and they indicated they have no concerns. He said no, none, about NCAA essentially retaliating against Alabama because of their decision to play Charles Bediako. Now, again, I don't want to try to interpret legal decisions or just the writing. And again, you can never say anything with certainty, but it's notable to point out in the temporary restraining order from the judge, it's called a restraining order because the NCAA is restrained from essentially using its laws and its rules and eligibilities. And I shouldn't say laws. The NCAA doesn't have laws, but they have bylaws. The NCAA can't enforce that based on the ruling in that judge's TRO in that order. So if you read that in that way, that's I think the conclusion a lot of people have come to, that Alabama would not be able to be punished for having played Charles Bediako. But again, I can't say that with certainty because I'm not a legal expert, but Alabama does not seem to be concerned about that potential.
Well, in big picture, Nick, and I hate to ask you to speculate, but it's a big question. What does this all mean for college athletics as far as you can tell, right? Because college eligibility appears to only be much murkier these days. As former college players who have some professional experience, they seek clearance through the NCAA and courts to return to school, as Bediako has. Requests have been approved for players from Santa Clara, Louisville, and BYU. And then the NCAA granted eligibility to former NBA draft pick James Najee, as you mentioned earlier. So where does Bediako fit into all this, and what kind of ripple effect or chain reaction do you see this causing in the near future?
Yeah, I think there'd be waves. I mean, not just a ripple, it'd be a wave, because it would open the door, if that preliminary injunction is granted, or the permanent one eventually, to professional players not being barred from coming back to college. And to me, Ben, that is, if something like that happens, this whole thing is going to have to be reinvented, and we're going to have to start over in a lot of ways, where the way that things have been done in terms of, declarations and dates for when you have to declare by and all those types of things, it's going to hit reset in a lot of ways on what this means. And in some ways, some people would argue that's a good thing, and that kind of burn it down and rebuild it. And that might be what's needed in college athletics right now, because this is not like the first thing of its kind. Yeah, it made history in some ways, but again, this door has been getting wider and wider, or it's been opening wider and wider because of the NCAA granting eligibility in the way it has. And so I think if he is in fact granted all that, the injunction to keep playing and play out the season, I think it just is it further reminds people that this really needs to be figured out, and they need to build a new system because the old one is not going to work.
Nick, I went to the Tennessee game in Coleman Coliseum, and I don't know how early you arrived, but it was earlier than I did, apparently, because if you looked out into the Coliseum, you saw these white shirts draped all over the seats, and they were shirts that whoever bought a ticket, they got to take one of these shirts home. I guess they were encouraging people to wear them to create some sort of environment. But I get there, and it's before tip-off, and my dad and I walk up to our two chairs, and no shirts, Nick. And the people sitting around our seats said, yeah, these two guys who didn't have your tickets or sit in your seats, they came and they sat there for a minute. We told them that you guys sat there, and they took the shirts. They took our complimentary Coleman Coliseum shirts. Nick, what does that say about the state of the world, do you think?
That's a low thing to do. I'd be kind of upset if I were you, Ben. I'm not going to lie.
I was pretty upset. So this is sticking with me even more than the Charles Bediako story.
We can invoke an investigation if you'd like.
If you could focus your attention on that instead of whatever is happening in court this week, I would greatly appreciate it. Nick Kelly, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
All right, check out Nick Kelly's work on AL.com. His, Matt Stahl, Michael Casagrande. Read all of our AL.com, Alabama basketball, football, whatever sports coverage. Check out the show wherever you get your podcast. Leave us a rating. Leave us a review. We want to hear from you in the comments. So please share with us what you think of this and everything else happening in Alabama athletics. Until next time, I'm Ben Flanagan with AL.com. Thanks, everybody.